So I'm really pleased today to be talking to Dr. Dave Neale, who is a PhD, post-PhD researcher at PEDAL, which is at the University of Cambridge. Dave, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Yeah, I've been involved in research into play and mainly focused on infancy to begin with. I now look at a broader age range, and I'm interested in including in play in adults now as well. But originally I did my PhD with David Whitebread at the University of Cambridge on play of parents and infants that were between 12 months and 24 months old. And then from around that time, the PEDAL Research Centre at Cambridge, which is the Centre for Research in Play, Education, Development and Learning, was just kind of being formed. My supervisor, David Whitebread, was the person who actually sort of negotiated it and brought in the funding for it. I went off to the US and did a year research with Roberta Golinkoff, who's done a lot of research on play and also on language, early language development. And then I came back and joined PEDAL as a postdoctoral researcher. And so PEDAL is now going quite strong. It's quite a large team of people now, and is, I think, the only research centre sort of entirely dedicated to play.
So what does the research tell us about the importance of play, particularly with very young babies?
Well, I think there's a lot of research that shows the importance of interaction in a broad sense is important to note. And a lot of research that shows the importance of language and infants being exposed to language. And play is an excellent context for those things to happen. So I think one thing we can think about is how play is a very engaging, quite natural activity for infants and toddlers. They don't sort of need to be encouraged really to do it. They'll just naturally engage in it. It is quite exploratory, it's quite open. And so they're in the right kind of frame of mind for learning when they engage in play, which means that the types of things they're exposed to, like language, new words, the types of interaction they're doing, having to maybe like read the sort of emotions and expressions of other people, those kind of opportunities for learning, it could be that they're in a better, more heightened state to process that than other states. And we know that things like rough and tumble play, which seems apparently mindless and quite simple, where you just kind of roll around on the floor maybe with your child, or sort of mini play fighting and things like that, may be important, even though it seems quite trivial. And there's been some research showing it relates to social development, particularly in boys later in life. And there's been research with other animals, like with rats, that have shown that if rats can't engage in that kind of play when they're young, they just can't socialize with other rats when they're adults. And it seems that there may be something in that kind of play, which is about reading sort of the fact that you're playing and you're not really fighting. You have to read the other person's expressions to check you're not hurting them, you're not going too far. You have to sort of maintain that feeling of enjoyment. You sometimes have to sort of give and take in terms of winning and losing, to keep it sort of entertaining and fair. So there's a lot of social stuff going on in what seems to be quite a mindless activity on the surface.
Are there different categorizations of play we should be thinking about when we're planning opportunities on working with children?
And it's been categorized in quite a few different ways by different people. Quite broadly, you can categorize it based on what you're playing with. So like rough and tumble play, like it's just described, is sort of play with kind of bodies and physical action play. But then you could also, for example, have object play, sort of construction play, playing with blocks and things like that. And you can have pretend play, which infants don't do a great deal of. It becomes more elaborate and extensive later on, but it's still important. So you can categorize based on what you're playing with, but you can also categorize based on kind kind of how much structure is involved in the play. So you get things like games, for example, have quite a lot of structure. They have rules, whereas something like rough and tumble play, as it normally happens, is incredibly open and free form. And so the amount of structure may affect the kinds of learning that occur. And if you are interested, if we're thinking simply about general development, and like, for example, with rough and tumble play, I said how it may help develop these kind of social capacities, then that may often happen in very free form types of play with little structure, because the infant or child will just be doing different things. They might be exploring objects and discovering things about them and learning what happens if they drop it or throw it and things like this. They'll be discovering things, but we or you don't have much control over what they're discovering necessarily, because there's no structure. They could go in any direction they want, which can be quite motivating and engaging and fun for them, but it doesn't, if you want them to learn something specific, then more structure is required. And obviously with something like direct teaching and instruction, that's very structured. You're really focusing them on one thing, but then it's also not as engaging and not as fun. So there is this kind of sweet spot you can try and obtain with play, where you're adding in some structure enough to direct learning in a certain direction, but that maintains the fun, enjoyable, free form aspects of it. And one way of doing that is games. Games kind of do that. They put in these rules, and that can potentially direct to certain types of learning and outcomes. And also, an adult in interacting with a child can provide some structure and point out learning opportunities. And there's been some research into what's been termed guided play over the last few years, which sort of essentially is an adult attempting to insert learning opportunities while keeping the activity as play.
So thinking about bringing items into the home for play, there are some items which can be anything. We can make play out of anything. So we can give a baby a bunch of keys and see what happens. There are some items that parents can buy which are very highly directed. You push a button and this lights up, or something that does just one action. And then you've got things like Lego or Duplo in the middle, obviously Lego Fund Pedal, which are items which can be made in played with in many ways. Is there value to having all three of those across the home environment?
Yeah, I think variety can be a good thing, because I think if you expose children to just a wide range of possibilities, they can learn different things from all of those kinds of objects you just described. And also they can learn different things if they're playing with them on their own, or if they're playing with another person, an adult, or maybe another child. So I think exposure to a wide range of things is good. One thing that the research does seem to suggest is there is something important about attention and distraction. There was a research study that found that if you gave children kind of a lot of options for toys all at once, loads of different toys, then they kind of quickly sort of move from one to the other, and they never really learn that much about one. Whereas if you give them a much more limited choice, they'll go much deeper and kind of focus on one thing and really get to grips with what it is and explore it. And as sort of focused attention is such an important skill as an adult for a whole variety of things, although social media these days is making, I think, more and more adults kind of have their attention kind of flitting around very quickly. But in general, focused attention is very important. And so I think you don't always want to have just everything available. It's quite good to give your child some limits on what they have. And hopefully that will mean they kind of focus more and gain this experience of how you really concentrate on one thing at a time.
What else can adults do to support play with their own children or children they are working with?
I think one way I often put it is that I think if what you want to do, it kind of depends on your aims to some extent. If what you want to do is sort of maintain the benefits of play for the child in the activity they're doing, then one approach is to kind of try and make it so you're playing as well. And what often happens in situations is you get adults sort of taking over play that children are doing and turning it into a teaching and learning exercise. And they may think it's still play, but we kind of know that it isn't, from some studies that have got children's views on what counts as play and what isn't, and what stops a situation being play. And we kind of know that a lot of times adults will do this kind of thing and they'll be like, oh, I'm playing and they're learning, but no, that's not really what's happening to the child. They've now stopped playing and it's got less interesting, and you've turned it into something they didn't want it to be. So if your intention is to just create a structured learning experience, then you could just do that. But if what you want is to kind of maintain that motivation and that higher level of interest and engagement, these kind of things that play gives your child, then I think it's important to not lose that. And one way is to just kind of try and play as well. Play with them, don't take it over, look at them as an equal partner. So you just kind of engage doing a similar kind of thing, and then you can gently insert types of learning, perhaps by asking questions like, oh, I wonder what happens if we put that on there. Not really telling them what to do, but kind of suggesting things, doing something yourself that they might then copy, naming things as you hold them and play them. So it's this kind of gentle amount of structure that you can insert that can help learning happen. There isn't so much structure it turns into just teaching, and isn't so little structure that it's just entirely free-form play with no specific learning goal.
And is it ever too early to engage in play with babies?
Well, I think it's just as soon as a baby can play, which is kind of very early, kind of depends what you count as play, I suppose, to some extent. But I think people quite naturally just engage in, but it's almost like play is kind of the first way babies have of interacting with the world to some extent. Everything is sort of play to a very young child. I mean, all they can do is interact with and explore this kind of weird, crazy stuff they're suddenly faced with, and see what happens as they interact with it, which is kind of play. So yeah, I don't think there's a too early point. I think there's no point in trying to sort of force things on a child that are clearly well beyond what they can do. But that's true of kind of everything, I think, for teaching and stuff as well. I think there's a lot of research that shows how the importance of kind of sensitivity and the importance of contingent responding, so that you try and read your child's kind of ability level and their interests and stuff, and you kind of try and interact with them in a way that appreciates those things and doesn't ignore them, and perhaps pushes them a bit, but not too much. You kind of want to push them. You want them sometimes to be able to go a bit beyond what they can do already, but you don't want to push them so hard that they just can't do it, and then that can kind of make them feel that learning isn't fun. And we don't really want that enjoyment of learning that they're often coming to the world with. We don't want that taken away.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time today. It's much appreciated.
Okay, thank you.